What happened to Queen Catherine Parr's daughter? She was born into great wealth and one of the most prominent families in England, but this little girl was a penniless orphan by the age of 7 months and disappears from the historical record after barely a year and a half. What happened to her, though, and how could someone who was the daughter of a queen, the cousin of Edward VI, and Mary I and Elizabeth I's stepsister just drop off the face of the earth like this? Did she grow up and marry, or did she die as a young child? Both theories have been suggested, and both will be looked at in this video. This is History Calling, and today I bring you the story of the life and mysterious disappearance of Lady Mary Seymour. Catherine Parr was born in around 1512 and is best known as the final wife of Henry VIII, who she married in 1543 as her third husband. She hadn't wanted to wed him though, as she already cherished a flame for his one-time brother-in-law, Thomas Seymour, brother of Henry's third wife, Jane. It is perhaps not that surprising then that when Henry died in January 1547, leaving the throne to his and Jane's son, Edward VI, Catherine proceeded to marry Thomas with indecent haste, waiting only a few months between husbands. The couple set up home at Chelsea Manor in London, along with Catherine's stepdaughter, Princess Elizabeth, and by the end of the year, the 35-year-old Dowager Queen was pregnant. This was a surprising turn of events, given that she was on her fourth husband and had never previously conceived, at least as far as we know, but it's always possible she had lost pregnancies during her first and second marriages that we don't have any record of. Unfortunately, Catherine's marriage wasn't going well, as her husband had been making advances on the teenaged Elizabeth, who was sent away in May 1548, but this had no impact on the pregnancy, which continued on as expected. Catherine moved to Thomas's home, Sudeley Castle in Gloucestershire, to give birth, and on the 30th of August she was delivered of a healthy baby girl, named Lady Mary Seymour after her stepsister Mary Tudor, later Mary I. Now, little Mary was born into an incredibly advantageous position. Her mother was the Queen Dowager, her first cousin was the King, her father was the Lord Admiral of England, and her family was filthy rich. She had it all. Before she was even 7 months old, though, she lost nearly everything. The first and most serious blow came on the 5th of September 1548, when she was less than a week old. For it was on that day that her mother, Catherine, died of childbed fever. On her deathbed, the Queen left all her worldly possessions to her husband, making no separate provision for Mary, though actually, as a married woman, I doubt she could have made a will which did anything else, for Thomas would have legally owned all her belongings anyway. By early 1549, the baby had been sent to Sion House in London and placed in the care of her paternal uncle, Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset and Lord Protector of England during the King's minority. That March, her father Thomas was executed for having tried to wrest Parr from his brother, and his money and estates, which now included everything Catherine Parr had had to her name as well, were forfeited. As a result, their daughter was now an orphan without a shilling to her name. Catherine's family showed little interest in having her, and so it was to Grimsthorpe, the home of her mother's friend, Katherine Brandon, formerly Willoughby, Dowager Duchess of Suffolk, that baby Mary went. According to historian John Strype, writing in 1721, this arrangement was at the behest of Edward Seymour before his death, but Strype offered no evidence to support that claim. However this situation came about, the Duchess was not one bit happy about it. Mary's finances ought to have been secure at this point, for a warrant to the Receiver of Wards was issued on the 17th of March and granted nearly £500 for, quote, diets, wages and liveries of the household of Mistress Mary Seymour for a year and a half, ended at the feast of the Annunciation of Our Lady next coming. However, the money never came, nor did the silver plate and household goods which the Duchess had been promised were on their way from Mary's former nursery at her uncle Somerset's home. Despite the girl's poverty, though, she was still the cousin of the King and the daughter of a queen, and Katherine Brandon was therefore expected to raise her in a manner which befitted these connections. She had a dozen servants, including a governess named Mrs. Aglionby, a nurse, and 2 maids, and paying for this household was an expensive business. By the 24th of July, Catherine Brandon was writing to William Cecil, then working as a secretary to the Duke of Somerset, to tell him that she had written to the Duke and his Duchess for financial assistance and to ask for the pension granted for Mary's maintenance back in March, but nothing was forthcoming, and the cost of the quasi-royal baby's care, quote, will not bring me out of debt this year. She also mentioned Catherine Parr's brother, William Parr, Marquess of Northampton, saying, my Lord Marquess of Northampton, to whom I should deliver her, hath as bad a back for such a burden as I have. He would receive her, but not willingly if he must receive her train. So Catherine Parr's brother was refusing to take his niece on the basis of how much it would cost him to pay her servants, despite the fact that after the fall of Thomas Seymour, he'd actually been granted the very house in which Mary had been born the previous year, her father's former seat at Sudeley. There was no talk of his sister Anne Parr, Countess of Pembroke, taking the girl either. Things did not improve. On the 27th of August, the Duchess of Suffolk wrote again to Cecil, reiterating her need for Mary's money and nursery goods, and bemoaning the continuing strain her wardship of the girl was putting on her purse, saying that she was a beggar, which was a relative term when one was a duchess, and that one of the chief causes of her problems was that, quote, the Queen's child hath lain and yet doth lie at my house with her company about her, wholly at my charges. I have written to my Lady Somerset, remember that's Mary's aunt, the Duchess of Somerset, at large, which was the letter I wrote, not this, with mine own hand unto you, and amongst other things for the child, that there may be some pensions allotted unto her, according to my Lord's grace promise. This is likely the money granted back in March. Now, good Cecil, help at a pinch all that you may help. My lady also sent me word at Whitsuntide last by Barty, that's Richard Bertie, who the Duchess of Suffolk would go on to marry in around 1552, that my Lord's grace at her suit had granted certain nursery plate should be delivered with the child, and lest there might be stay for lack of a present bill of such plate and stuff as was there in the nursery, I send you one here enclosed of all such parcels as were appointed out for the child's only use. She means that just in case there's a delay in sending the goods because there is no list of what ought to be going, she'll include such a list with this letter. She then continues, and that you may the better understand that I cry not before I am pricked, I send you also Mistress Eglamby's governess letter unto me, who, with the maids, nurse, and others, daily call on me for their wages, whose voices mine ears may hardly bear, but my coffers much worse. Wherefore I cease, and commit me and my sickness to your diligent care. As promised, she included a long list of the household goods that ought to have arrived with Mary. I'm not going to get into that here, as it's not particularly relevant to the story of Mary's life and disappearance, but if you follow me over on Patreon and are in the Time Traveller or Historical Figure tiers, I'll be sharing it there, and you'll get to hear what a rich little girl's nursery ought to have looked like. As historian Agnes Strickland said in the 19th century, it appears that Mary's paternal uncle and aunt, the Duke and Duchess of Somerset, were withholding even the child's few remaining belongings, while her maternal uncle, Lord Northampton, was refusing to involve himself in her care at all. It's hard not to feel sorry for this little baby, who is now so unwanted in the world. At least she'll have been too young to understand what was happening. Eventually, some financial provision was made for Mary. In January 1550, an Act of Parliament was passed, which first acknowledged that she was, quote, a person in her blood and lineage corrupted due to her father's treason, but then went on to ensure that she and her heirs were, quote, restored and enabled only in blood as daughter and heir and heirs to the said Thomas Lord Seymour. She was therefore allowed to inherit any property and money which had not been stripped away from Thomas by his attainder, though admittedly this won't have been much in the grand scheme of things, but it was something. This document is the last confirmed reference we have to Mary, then aged less than a year and a half. No claim was ever made on Thomas's remaining estate, which strongly suggests that she died quite soon after this, probably that same year, given that we hear nothing else of her from the Duchess of Suffolk. The Protestant Catherine Brandon would go on to flee England with her new husband in early 1555 due to the Catholicism of the then Queen Mary I, and only returned in 1558. There has never been any suggestion that she took Mary Seymour with her. So what had happened to the girl? There is just one near contemporary source which gives us a clue as to the child's fate, and that is a poem written by John Parkhurst. I came across this via the work of writer Linda Porter, and so I've linked her biography of Catherine Parr below for you. Parkhurst was born in about 1511 and became the domestic chaplain to the Duke and Duchess of Suffolk in 1542, so he will have known Catherine Brandon well. He was also domestic chaplain to Catherine Parr in the later 1540s and was at the Dowager Queen's deathbed in September 1548, so he was well acquainted with little Mary's family and guardian, and it stands to reason that he took an interest in her and knew her fate. The poem he wrote, which may allude to her death, was part of a collection which was complete by 1558, when it was prepared for publication in Zurich. The reason Parkhurst was out of England was that, like the Duchess of Suffolk, he was Protestant and he'd fled after the Catholic Mary I came to the throne. The collection did not ultimately appear in London until 1573, when it was published under the title Ludicresive Epigrammata Juvenilia. As this title suggests, the contents were in Latin. However, lucky you, I'm going to give you the English translation of the relevant poem, followed by an analysis of it. It reads, I, whom at the cost of her own life my queenly mother bore with the pangs of labour, sleep under this marble, an unfit traveller. If death had given me to live longer, that virtue, that modesty, that obedience of my excellent mother, that heavenly courageous nature, would have lived again in me. Now, whomever you are, fare thee well, because I cannot speak any more. This stone is a memorial to my brief life. Now, if we take the scant biographical details given in this poem literally, and I think we can because Parkhurst will have wanted people to know to whom he was referring, he is discussing the child of a queen who caused the death of its mother in childbirth and then died young themselves. 3 16th century English queens and their children fit this description. Elizabeth of York, who died in 1503, as did her newborn daughter. Jane Seymour, who died in 1537 after delivering the future Edward VI, who then died at the age of 15, and Catherine Parr, who, as we've heard, died in 1548. The poem also strongly insinuates that the child in question was a girl, given the references to it emulating its mother's virtue, modesty, and obedience. But Elizabeth of York and her daughter are very unlikely candidates, as Parkhurst was born years after their deaths, and as a Protestant he would be unlikely to have eulogized a Catholic queen. Jane Seymour had a boy, but it's also hard to believe that Parkhurst was thinking of her son, as he surely would have mentioned the fact that the subject of his poem became a monarch. Instead, Catherine Parr seems to be by far the likeliest candidate. Parkhurst knew her very well. She had a girl. He will have seen the infant Mary just after her birth, and he was close to her guardian, Catherine Brandon. If we accept these verses are about Mary, then his description of this child's brief life strongly insinuates that the little girl died very young. The fact that the poem was complete by 1558 indicates that she didn't live past the age of 10. Parkhurst's tribute is the best information we have as to Mary's fate, but there are some later hints that she died young too. John Strype, who you'll recall wrote in 1721, said that she died soon after the 1550 Act of Parliament which restored her inheritance rights. He gave no source for his information, but it's possible he had evidence to draw upon which is now lost to us. In other cases, historians weren't even sure of Mary's existence in the first place. John Nichols, writing in 1823, said that Catherine died childless, quote, or as some have said, leaving an infant daughter who not long survived her. Given that it was childbirth that killed her, it's remarkable that Nichols wasn't sure if she was a mother or not. Historian Edmund Lodge followed the same line as John Strype in 1849 and may well have read the earlier man's work when he said, without citing a source, that Mary, quote, died as an infant. Then we come to Agnes Strickland, who had something very different to say about Mary's fate. First, she claimed that Edmund Lodge had said that Mary lived to the age of 13, but I found nothing in Lodge's work to support this, and as I've just told you, he actually said that the girl died as an infant. This therefore looks like an error on Strickland's part, who didn't cite any of Lodge's publications and whose work has an awful lot of factual mistakes in it, which are too numerous to list here. Indeed, Strickland's well-known tendency to make such errors is just one of the many reasons that we should be cautious about believing the other fantastical account she gave of Mary's life. Strickland wrote that she had spoken to a Mr. Johnson Lawson and his brother Henry Lawson, and that they claimed to be descended from Mary Seymour. They produced a piece of paper which they said was written by an earlier member of their family, and endorsed with the words, "Copy of manuscript fragment entitled A Good Account of My Pedigree given me by my grandmother, July 26, 1749. It stated that Mary Seymour had married a man called Sir Edward Bushel, and that they had had a daughter who had then married one Silas Johnson. This couple then had a daughter themselves called Mary Johnson, who married a Reverend Francis Drayton of Littlechart in Kent, and from there the descent continued down to the two Lawson brothers Strickland met in the mid-19th century. The Edward Bushel that Lady Mary Seymour supposedly married was, according to a footnote, probably the same man who was, quote, a gentleman of the household to Anne of Denmark, the Queen of James I, and with 9 other knights assisted in bearing her body to the grave, end quote. The Lawsons also claimed to have a number of relics in their family which had belonged to Catherine Parr, such as a damask napkin, which they said had initially belonged to Henry VIII's first wife, Catherine of Aragon, then made its way to Catherine Parr, then survived down to the 19th century. The other item was meant to be, quote, the royal arms of King Henry, engraved on copper in cameo, which were set in the centre of a large pewter dish. It would be lovely to think that Mary Seymour grew up and had a chance to marry and have a family and home of her own, but unfortunately the whole story suffers from numerous serious lapses in logic. First, there's the fact that we can't confirm this manuscript with the pedigree on it ever really existed. Strickland only saw a copy, which could have been written up that morning for all we know. Second, if the Lawson brothers really did have an old manuscript, we still don't know that it really dated to 1749, or who wrote it. We don't know who the grandmother and grandchild mentioned on it were. Third, even if we're very generous and say that it was real and that it did date to that year, our source, in inverted commas, becomes a piece of hearsay dictated by an old woman 200 years after Lady Mary Seymour was last heard of. There is no other paper trail to support this genealogy, and our so-called chain of evidence is absolutely laughable. So the very existence of this source is highly suspect, and its provenance, if it was genuine, has all the reliability of a fairy tale. But what about its contents? Here too we hit a number of obstacles. For starters, when was this marriage supposed to have taken place? Catherine Brandon left England in 1555, when little Mary would have been 6 years old, and doesn't seem to have taken her along for the trip. Are we meant to believe the marriage was arranged by that point, which is what Agnes Strickland conjectured? Well, early alliances were made in this period, but if a girl of Mary's status was being wed and sent straight to her new husband's household, we'd expect to have some contemporary evidence of it. Also, if Mary married then or later, why do we have no other proof of her existence after 1550? Why was no claim ever made on her father's remaining estate? If she'd lived long enough to be wed, she would have needed it as a marriage portion. Next, we need to consider Strickland's claim that Sir Henry Bushel worked for Anne of Denmark and even carried her body to its grave. That queen didn't marry her husband, James VI of Scotland, until 1589. She didn't become Queen of England until 1603, and she died in 1619. For Bushel to have been Mary Seymour's husband, he would need to have been an elderly man by the time of Queen Anne's death, and hardly in a fit state to be a pallbearer. The timeline here is all wrong. At the very least, we've skipped a generation. There was a Sir Edward Bushel around in the 1620s, for I found a reference to a play by James Shirley dedicated to him in 1628, but there's little chance it could be the same person marrying Mary back in the 1550s. Even if we try to argue that the marriage might have taken place later and to Edward Bushel's father perhaps, that still doesn't get us around the problem of there being no other record of it, or of Mary herself, despite her position as the cousin or stepsister of the final 3 Tudor monarchs. As for the supposed relics, if they existed at all, there's no proof that they dated to the Tudor era, or that they came from Catherine Parr, or that they were acquired via descent from her daughter. We just can't make this story work. At best, the whole thing looks like a misunderstanding on the part of the Lawson family. At worst, it was a deliberately fabricated piece of fiction designed to get attention. This may sound like a silly motive to some, but bear in mind, I get people under my YouTube videos claiming to be descended from Anne Boleyn all the time, despite the fact that she had only one surviving child who produced no offspring of her own. People dream up stupid things to make themselves feel important all the time. While we're talking about historical fantasy, at the time of creating this video, I also saw a story on Wikipedia stating that maybe Mary was whisked off to Ireland and raised there. It had no citations to support it though, and I found no other evidence of this tale. So unless new, reliable evidence comes to light, I'm chalking this up as yet another lie fabricated about the Tudors by the internet. I'm only mentioning it at all because I know I'll get asked about it in the comments if I don't. So my conclusion is that Lady Mary Seymour almost certainly died as a young child. If I had to put money on a year, I'd say 1550, as this is the last time we hear of her. Had she lived, she would have been the stepsister of Mary I and Elizabeth I, and it is practically inconceivable that someone with her connections wouldn't have been mentioned in any other sources. Instead, we might reasonably have expected her to show up at Elizabeth's court, possibly even in the Queen's own household. Now, it might seem odd to us that a child we would now call a celebrity baby just disappeared off the face of the earth, but it's really not. First of all, it may well have been remarked on, and we just don't have the relevant evidence anymore. This did happen nearly half a millennium ago after all. Second, child mortality rates were absolutely dismal in this era, and it was heartbreakingly common for children under 5 to die. Having spent such a short time on Earth, their lives and deaths often weren't well attested. For example, despite being the Queen and under a metaphorical microscope, we still aren't 100% sure how many pregnancies Catherine of Aragon had, or how long some of her babies lived, while the exact end of Anne Boleyn's failed pregnancy of 1534 went virtually unremarked upon. It's a mistake to project our social standards and thought patterns onto the people of the past. They lived in a very different world in many respects, and didn't think about things like the death of orphan toddlers, even the child of a former queen, in the same way that we would. Mary likely passed away with very little fuss and was given a quiet funeral. It wasn't even the done thing to go into mourning for children this young because of how frequently they died, so we wouldn't expect to see any outpouring of grief, real or simulated, at the court of her cousin, Edward VI. I hope you've enjoyed hearing about this Tudor mystery, even though it does have a tragic ending. Please remember to like the video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss an upload. If you want to learn more about Catherine Parr, try this video to hear all about her marriages to Henry and Thomas, and the scandalous way in which the latter treated the teenage Elizabeth. If you want to know about the disgraceful treatment of Catherine's remains, watch this one instead. Whatever you choose, please enjoy, and until next time, keep learning.